The afternoon sun fell gently over the busy streets, casting long shadows between the tall buildings. The air was filled with the usual sounds of the city: honking cars, distant construction, and the low hum of people walking and talking. Among the crowd, a man walked at a steady pace, hands in his pockets, a small backpack resting on his shoulder. He was dressed casually, jeans and a plain shirt, blending into the flow of everyday life. His mind was focused on ordinary thoughts: groceries he needed to pick up, a phone call he had to make, and dinner plans for the evening. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing, that is, until the sudden sound of sirens pierced the air, closer and louder than usual. A police car pulled up nearby, lights flashing, but no loud siren this time, and the man barely noticed it at first. He kept walking, moving along the sidewalk, when a uniformed officer stepped out and began approaching him. The man slowed down instinctively, sensing something was off. The officer's expression was stern, almost unreadable, and his steps were deliberate. He stopped a few feet in front of the man, hands resting on his belt. "Excuse me," the officer said, his voice firm but not raised. The man looked up, meeting the gaze of authority, and nodded politely. "Yes, officer?" "You need to step aside for a moment," the officer said. There was no smile, no friendliness. The words sounded ordinary enough, but the tone carried a weight that made the man pause. He complied, moving slightly to the side of the sidewalk, giving room as the officer examined him. "What's the issue?" the man asked calmly, trying to keep the conversation simple. He had encountered police before and always aimed to stay cooperative. But there was an underlying tension he could feel building in the pit of his stomach. The officer did not respond immediately, his eyes scanning the surroundings as though searching for something else. A moment passed. Then suddenly the officer's tone changed. It grew sharper, edged with impatience. "I said step aside now!" The man froze for a second, confused by the sudden aggression. "I'm moving," he said, taking a cautious step back. He tried to show he was not resisting, his hand slightly raised to indicate compliance. But the officer's reaction was swift, almost exaggerated. In an instant, he grabbed the man's arm and shoved him forward. The man stumbled, trying to regain balance, but the force was too much. He hit the pavement hard, a sharp pain shooting through his shoulder and knee. A gasp escaped him, and a few pedestrians nearby stopped, their eyes widening in shock. The officer loomed over him, breathing heavily, but his face showed no concern for the man sprawled on the ground. "Don't move," he commanded, his voice cold and loud enough to draw attention. The man's hands instinctively went up, not in defiance but as a natural reaction to the fear surging through him. Around them, people had started to notice. A woman holding a small child stopped, shielding the child slightly while her eyes darted between the man and the officer. A man sitting on a nearby bench reached for his phone but hesitated, unsure if filming was safe. The street, once filled with ordinary life, seemed to freeze in tension for a few moments. The man on the ground felt a mix of fear, confusion, and anger. He had not done anything wrong. He had only been walking along the sidewalk, minding his own business. Yet here he was, pinned by the force of authority, his body aching from the fall, his heart racing. He tried to speak, to explain, but the words caught in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to stay calm, to not make the situation worse. The officer, meanwhile, was scanning the street. It was unclear whether he was looking for something specific or simply asserting control over the scene. "I said stay down," he barked, and the man complied, though each word felt heavier than the last. He could feel the eyes of strangers on him, some shocked, some curious, some quietly judging. The awareness of being watched added a layer of humiliation to the pain he was already feeling. A few moments later, a passerby finally spoke up. "Hey, sir, are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice gentle but firm. The officer ignored her, his attention still fixed on the man on the ground. The man tried to nod to show he was okay, but the pain in his shoulder made it difficult. He could feel every movement, every shift of weight, reminding him that this was not a minor bump or scrape. It was real, it was deliberate, and it hurt. The sound of a camera clicking broke through the tension. Someone from across the street had decided to record the incident. The officer noticed and his demeanor stiffened. "Stop that!" he shouted, but the damage was done. The moment was captured, frozen in time for anyone who might see it later. The man, lying on the ground, closed his eyes for a brief second, taking in deep, shaky breaths. He tried to steady himself to think clearly. He had faced challenges before, but nothing like this. The suddenness of the attack, the public display, and the sheer force of authority pressed down on him like a physical weight. He reminded himself to stay calm, to not make sudden movements, even as his body protested. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The officer eventually stepped back slightly, as if remembering some unwritten rule of procedure. The man remained on the ground, wincing with each breath, each minor movement. Pedestrians murmured among themselves, some offering quiet words of support, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Finally, the man found the strength to sit up, gingerly pushing himself against the curb. Pain radiated from his shoulder and his knee throbbed, but he managed to steady himself. His mind raced, not with fear this time, but with a growing determination. He could not let this moment define him. He could not allow the fear to take over completely. The officer continued to observe him, perhaps expecting him to make a mistake, perhaps unsure what to do next. The man took a slow, deep breath and spoke calmly, though his voice still carried a tremor. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said. "I was just walking. You knocked me down for no reason." The officer's eyes narrowed. He did not reply immediately. Instead, he adjusted his belt, as though preparing for a new action, but hesitation flickered across his face. The man noticed it, and it gave him a small measure of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for accountability here. People around them had begun to gather, curious and concerned. Some whispered to each other, some kept their distance, and a few even stepped closer, ready to intervene if necessary. The energy of the street had shifted, from normalcy to tension, from routine to a charged atmosphere where everyone sensed the unfairness of what had just happened. The man slowly stood, every movement deliberate to avoid further provocation. He ignored the pain in his body, focusing instead on keeping his balance and showing calm. He glanced at the officer who still watched him, now with a mix of caution and something else, perhaps uncertainty, perhaps unease. Then the officer spoke finally, but his words did not carry the authority he had hoped. "You need to go," he said, his voice lower now, almost hesitant. The man nodded, taking careful steps away, not wanting to escalate the situation. But in his mind, he made a promise. This incident would not end here. There would be consequences. He would make sure of it, not out of anger, but out of a desire for fairness and justice. As he walked away, the man noticed the faces around him. Some nodded in silent support, some shook their heads in disbelief. He felt a quiet sense of connection to the witnesses, people who had seen the injustice and could not unsee it. He also felt a spark of courage, knowing that he was not alone in this, that there were others who would stand by truth and fairness. By the time he reached a quieter corner of the street, away from the immediate crowd, his heart had slowed a little, though the adrenaline still lingered. He called a close friend to recount the events, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The friend listened, offering words of support and concern, helping him feel grounded. Together they discussed the next steps, filing a report, finding a lawyer, making sure that what had happened would be documented. The man's thoughts drifted to the officer. What had caused such aggression, such a sudden and violent action? He could not understand it fully, but he refused to let confusion turn into fear. Instead, he focused on what he could control, documenting the incident, seeking justice and protecting himself in the future. As the afternoon light began to fade and the street returned to its usual rhythm, the man walked with a renewed sense of purpose. He had experienced fear, pain, and humiliation, but he had also discovered resilience within himself. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. Facing a system that often favored authority over fairness was daunting, but he was determined. And so, with each careful step, he moved forward not as a victim, but as someone who would not be silenced, someone who would ensure that the truth of that afternoon was not forgotten. The city around him continued its noisy, bustling life, unaware of the quiet determination growing in the heart of one ordinary man who had just faced extraordinary injustice. The day after the incident felt heavier than usual. The man woke up with his shoulder sore and his knee stiff, but the aches were nothing compared to the weight pressing on his mind. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment when he had been knocked to the ground. Every detail was vivid, the sudden shove, the hard impact, the officer standing over him. He could feel the shock all over again, but now it was mixed with a rising sense of determination. He knew he could not let this go unnoticed. After breakfast, he called a friend who had been with him during the previous day, someone he trusted completely. The friend listened patiently as he described the event, every word filled with frustration and disbelief. "You need to report this," the friend said firmly. "It's not just about what happened to you. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The man nodded, knowing the advice was right. He had no choice but to face what came next, even though it was intimidating. He decided to visit the police station to file a formal complaint. As he approached the building, a sense of unease grew in his chest. He had seen authority used against him the day before, and now he would have to step into the same environment, facing people who represented that power. His palms were slightly sweaty as he entered the station, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He had a purpose, and that purpose was justice. Inside, the front desk officer listened as he explained what had happened. The man recounted the incident slowly, carefully, trying to stay composed despite the tension in his voice. "I was walking down the street," he said, "and I was pushed to the ground by an officer for no reason. I want this reported. I want it documented." The officer at the desk nodded, took notes, and provided him with the proper forms. Filling out the complaint was both frustrating and exhausting. Every word felt heavy, like each sentence carried the weight of an injustice he had endured. But as he signed the forms, he felt a small spark of control returning to him. He was no longer powerless. By taking action, by speaking up, he was reclaiming some part of the dignity that had been taken from him. After leaving the station, he sat on a bench outside for a few minutes, letting the sun warm his face. The city moved on around him, unaware of the struggle that had just begun. Cars passed, pedestrians hurried, and the sounds of everyday life continued. But he felt a quiet sense of purpose. He knew this was only the beginning. The complaint would start the process, but it would take more to make sure the officer faced consequences. He spent the next few days gathering evidence. He returned to the street where the incident had happened, looking for anyone who had seen what occurred. He spoke to shop owners and pedestrians, explaining the situation politely, hoping someone might remember details that could help. A few people nodded, promising to give statements if needed. One woman even showed him a short video she had recorded on her phone, capturing part of the moment when he was knocked down. Watching it was painful but also empowering. The evidence was real, undeniable, and it could support his case. During this time, he began searching for a lawyer who specialized in cases like his. He wanted someone who understood not only the law but also the human impact of such incidents. He met with several attorneys describing the event in detail and sharing the video evidence. One lawyer stood out, a composed, careful professional who listened closely and asked thoughtful questions. "We can help," the lawyer said. This officer acted beyond his authority. "We'll make sure the truth comes out." The man felt relief. Finally, he had someone in his corner, someone who could guide him through the intimidating process ahead. The lawyer's office became a place of planning and strategy. They discussed every detail of the incident, reviewing the video footage and the statements he had collected. The lawyer explained how the complaint would proceed, what the officer might say in his defense, and the steps necessary to hold him accountable. The man listened carefully, asking questions whenever he was unsure. He learned that justice required patience and preparation, not just courage. Meanwhile, the emotional toll of the incident weighed on him. Each time he recalled the officer's shove, the fear and humiliation resurfaced. Sleeping was difficult, and even walking down familiar streets felt tense. He knew these feelings were normal, but they reminded him why he had to fight for accountability, not just for himself, but for others who might experience similar injustice. The lawyer encouraged him to focus on small steps, to document everything, and to lean on the support of friends and family. He also began talking to local community members. Word of the incident had spread, and people approached him with concern and encouragement. Some shared their own experiences with authority, while others offered advice or simply listened. These conversations reminded him that he was not alone. There was a network of people who cared about fairness and justice, people who understood the impact of such incidents on ordinary lives. Days turned into weeks, and the process slowly unfolded. The lawyer submitted the formal complaint and prepared the case for a potential court hearing. They collected medical reports documenting his injuries, statements from witnesses, and even expert opinions on appropriate police conduct. Each piece of evidence strengthened his case, and each step brought him closer to the possibility of justice. Despite the progress, moments of doubt still crept in. He worried about retaliation, about being dismissed, about the frustration of facing a system that often protected those in authority. But each time doubt arose, he reminded himself why he was doing this. He was not seeking revenge. He was seeking truth. He was not trying to humiliate the officer. He was trying to ensure that abuse of power did not go unchecked. These thoughts gave him resilience. In the evenings, he often walked through the city, reflecting on what had happened. He noticed small things he had overlooked before: the kindness of strangers, the beauty of a sunset over the buildings, the laughter of children in a nearby park. These moments reminded him that life continued even after traumatic events. They gave him strength to face the challenges ahead. During one such walk, he ran into the woman who had recorded the video. She smiled warmly and encouraged him to stay strong. "People need to see what happened," she said. "It's not right, and it should be known." Her words resonated deeply. He realized that by taking action, he was contributing to a larger effort to ensure fairness in the community. It was not just about him. It was about standing against injustice wherever it appeared. The lawyer continued to guide him through the process, explaining the importance of staying calm and composed. They practiced recounting the incident clearly, emphasizing facts over emotions, preparing for potential questions from the officer or his representatives. These rehearsals were exhausting but necessary. Each practice session built confidence, showing him that he could face the courtroom without being overwhelmed by fear or anger. Community support grew steadily. Friends, neighbors, and even some strangers offered encouragement and advice. Some shared resources for legal aid. Others suggested ways to document interactions with authorities more effectively. The man felt a sense of connection and solidarity that strengthened his resolve. He was no longer isolated in his struggle. He was part of a network that believed in fairness and justice. As the date of the first hearing approached, his anxiety and anticipation increased. He knew that the courtroom would be a different kind of challenge. He would have to face the officer directly, recount the incident in front of others, and defend his right to be treated fairly. But he also knew he was prepared. The evidence, the witness statements, and the lawyer's guidance gave him confidence. He was not just a victim. He was someone taking control of the situation. The night before the hearing, he could hardly sleep. His mind kept returning to the incident, to the officer's sudden aggression, and to the humiliation he had endured. But he also thought about the steps he had taken, the support he had received, and the evidence he had gathered. Slowly, he felt a sense of determination replacing fear. He was ready to face the challenge, ready to stand for what was right, and ready to show that one person could demand accountability even against authority. On the morning of the hearing, he dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were neat and professional. He wanted to present himself with dignity, to show that he was serious and composed. He met his lawyer outside the courthouse, and together they went over the key points once more. The lawyer reminded him to stay calm, to focus on facts, and to trust the process. The man nodded, taking deep breaths to steady his nerves. As they entered the courthouse, he felt a mixture of fear, anticipation, and resolve. The building was imposing, filled with people moving with purpose, but he felt grounded. He knew why he was there, and he knew that the truth was on his side. The weeks of preparation, the support of friends and community, and his own inner strength had brought him to this moment. Sitting in the waiting area, he looked around at the other people in the courthouse. Some were lawyers, some were defendants, some were witnesses. Each had their own story, their own struggles, and their own hopes for justice. He felt a quiet solidarity with them, recognizing that the pursuit of fairness was never easy, but always important. When his name was called, he rose with steady hands and a clear mind. Walking into the courtroom, he felt the weight of the past few weeks, but also the strength that came from taking action. The officer would be there, and soon they would face each other. But the fear that had gripped him in the street was replaced by determination. He was ready to tell his story, to stand for fairness, and to seek justice not just for himself, but for anyone who had faced similar treatment. And so, as he took his place in the courtroom, the man carried with him the lessons of the past weeks: courage, resilience, and the unwavering belief that one voice, when guided by truth and determination, could demand accountability even in the face of power. The journey was far from over, but this was the moment when the first step toward justice began in earnest. The days leading up to the court hearing were filled with a mix of preparation and quiet tension. The man spent much of his time in the lawyer's office, sitting across from a desk piled with papers, files, and notes. Each document represented a piece of the story: the incident, the injuries, the witness accounts, and even the video evidence captured by a bystander. The lawyer methodically went through each item, explaining how it would be presented, what questions might come, and what the man needed to say. At first, he felt overwhelmed. The amount of information, the legal jargon, and the idea of facing the officer again made his chest tighten, but his lawyer had a way of breaking things down into manageable steps. "Focus on the facts," the lawyer said. "Your job is to tell your story clearly. Let the evidence do the rest." The man nodded, repeating the points in his mind like a mantra: facts, clarity, calm. One of the most challenging parts was reviewing the video footage of the incident. Watching it again brought back the sharp memory of the shove, the fall, the pain, and the embarrassment. Every time he saw the officer's hand push him to the ground, his stomach twisted. Yet, as painful as it was, he knew it was necessary. The video was undeniable proof. It showed exactly what had happened, and that truth was on his side. The lawyer also encouraged him to speak with witnesses again. They contacted several pedestrians who had seen the incident, asking them to clarify details and write statements. Some witnesses had been hesitant at first, unsure of their role, but as they recounted what they saw, their voices carried sincerity and conviction. Each statement added strength to the case, reinforcing the narrative that the man had been knocked down without reason. Despite the legal work, the emotional aspect was never far from his mind. Each day he felt the weight of the incident lingering over him. He had to remind himself to breathe, to rest, and to focus on small moments of normal life. He went for walks, visited a local park, and sometimes just sat quietly, letting his thoughts settle. These moments were crucial. They reminded him that he was more than the incident, more than the pain, and more than the fear. Friends and family continued to support him. They offered encouragement, helped with errands, and sometimes just listened when he needed to talk. Their presence was grounding. They reminded him that he was not alone, that he had a network of people who cared, and that justice was not just an abstract idea. It was a pursuit shared by many who valued fairness. The lawyer introduced another step: role-playing potential court scenarios. They practiced questions the officer might be asked, questions from the judge, and even interruptions that could occur during the proceedings. At first, the exercises felt awkward and intimidating. The man stumbled over his words, felt nervous, and struggled to remain calm. But with each practice session, his confidence grew. He learned to speak slowly, clearly, and with conviction. He discovered that the more prepared he was, the less fear had power over him. One afternoon, as they were preparing in the office, the lawyer paused and looked directly at him. "Remember," the lawyer said, "this is not just about fear or anger. This is about truth and fairness. You're not fighting an imaginary battle. You are presenting what actually happened. That is your strength." The man absorbed the words, letting them sink in. He repeated them quietly to himself as he left the office. Truth, fairness, strength. Outside the office, the city continued as usual. People hurried to work, buses rattled past, and street vendors called out their daily specials. Yet in the man's mind, the street where he had been knocked down remained vivid. He could see the faces of the bystanders, the expressions of shock and concern, and the abrupt force of the officer's shove. Walking past that street now was different. He no longer felt only fear. He felt determination. That spot had become a symbol of the injustice he was standing against. He spent time preparing not just facts, but emotions as well. He knew that recounting the incident would inevitably bring back feelings of fear, embarrassment, and anger. His lawyer advised him to acknowledge those emotions without letting them control him. "It's okay to feel upset," the lawyer said. "The key is to present yourself with dignity. Let the evidence show what happened, and let your composure speak for itself." Each evening he reviewed his notes and rehearsed in front of a mirror. He spoke aloud, sometimes pausing, sometimes adjusting the way he described events to make them clear and precise. It felt strange at first, almost mechanical, but gradually he began to feel a sense of ownership over the story. This was his experience, his truth, and he had the right to tell it. The practice made him stronger, more confident, and ready to face the courtroom. He also began thinking about the officer he would face again. There was a strange mixture of emotions: frustration, fear, and curiosity. What would the officer say? Would he deny everything? Would he show any remorse? The uncertainty made him nervous, but it also reinforced why preparation was so important. He could not control the officer's actions, but he could control his own. He could present facts clearly, respond calmly, and stand firm in his resolve. Community support played a crucial role in these days of preparation. Local activists and neighbors offered advice, shared their experiences, and expressed solidarity. Some even offered to accompany him to the courthouse, not to intervene, but to provide moral support. Their presence reminded him that justice was not an isolated effort. It was a shared responsibility. People were watching, caring, and willing to support fairness. As the date of the court hearing drew closer, the tension grew. The man often felt restless, pacing the apartment, reviewing notes, and imagining possible scenarios. He thought about what the officer might do, how witnesses might respond, and how the judge might react. These thoughts sometimes caused sleepless nights, but they also strengthened his resolve. Each scenario he imagined was an opportunity to prepare, to anticipate, and to act with confidence. One morning, while reviewing documents with the lawyer, the man realized how much he had learned. He had gained an understanding of legal procedures, evidence collection, and courtroom etiquette. More importantly, he had learned about resilience, courage, and the importance of standing up for oneself. The incident that had started with fear and pain was now shaping him into someone more aware, more prepared, and more determined. Despite all the preparation, the man knew that the courtroom would be challenging. He would face authority directly, recount a moment of humiliation, and rely on evidence and witnesses to prove his case. It was intimidating to think about, but he also knew that fear would not control him. Each step he had taken, the complaint, gathering evidence, talking to witnesses, practicing with his lawyer, had built a foundation of strength. He would not crumble under pressure. He would face the challenge with dignity and clarity. Even simple routines were affected during this time. Every trip outside reminded him of the incident. Every interaction with authority felt heightened, and every moment of silence seemed filled with anticipation. Yet, he learned to channel these feelings into preparation, using tension as motivation rather than allowing it to paralyze him. Each day he grew more confident in his ability to face the courtroom and tell his story effectively. One evening, he received a call from a witness who had initially been hesitant to speak. The witness had reviewed their statement and added more detail, offering a fuller picture of the incident. Hearing the account strengthened his confidence. He realized that the truth was on his side, and that the voices of those who saw what happened mattered. Each new detail added weight to his case, and each supportive voice reminded him that he was not alone. The lawyer also worked on strategy, explaining how the case might unfold, what challenges could arise, and how to respond if unexpected events occurred. They discussed the importance of staying calm under pressure, presenting facts clearly, and avoiding emotional reactions that could be used against him. These discussions, while sometimes exhausting, provided clarity and direction. The man knew exactly what he needed to do, and that clarity eased some of his anxiety. As the days counted down to the hearing, the man found moments of reflection. He thought about how ordinary life could change in an instant, how a single act of aggression could leave lasting emotional and physical scars. But he also reflected on resilience, on the support he had received, and on the power of taking action. These reflections reinforced his commitment to justice and his determination to stand strong. The night before the hearing, he could barely sleep. His mind replayed every detail of the incident, the preparation, and the conversations with his lawyer and community. He felt nervous but also ready. He had done everything he could to prepare, and he trusted in the process. He reminded himself of the mantra he had repeated for weeks: facts, clarity, calm, truth, fairness, strength. When the morning came, he dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were neat and professional. He wanted to present himself as composed, serious, and confident. His lawyer met him at the courthouse, reviewing key points one last time. The man took deep breaths, steadying his nerves. focusing on the preparation and the strength he had built over the past weeks. Walking into the courthouse, he felt the weight of anticipation. The building was imposing, filled with people who had their own stories, struggles, and hopes. Yet amidst the crowd, he felt grounded. He knew why he was there, and he knew that the truth was on his side. This moment was the result of weeks of preparation, reflection, and resilience. He was ready to face the courtroom, the officer, and the challenge ahead. The courtroom was a large, echoing space with high ceilings and rows of polished wooden benches. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting a warm glow on the solemn faces of those inside. The man felt a mixture of anxiety and determination as he stepped through the doorway. He was guided by his lawyer, who gave him a reassuring nod. The sounds of whispered conversations and shuffling papers filled the room, but a quiet intensity hung in the air. As he walked toward the front, he saw the officer for the first time since the incident. Their eyes met across the room, and the officer froze for a moment. Recognition flashed across his face, quickly replaced by a controlled, professional expression. The man felt a small surge of confidence. The officer might have believed he could intimidate or ignore him before, but now the courtroom was different. Here the truth had a voice, and that voice was his. The judge entered, and the room immediately fell silent. The authority of the courtroom was palpable. Everyone took their seats, and the man settled into the chair beside his lawyer. He straightened his back, took a deep breath, and focused on the task ahead. Weeks of preparation, rehearsal, and reflection had brought him to this moment. He was ready to tell his story, to stand firmly on the evidence, and to seek accountability. The hearing began with procedural formalities. The clerk read the case details, the officer's defense attorney spoke briefly, and then the focus shifted to the man and his lawyer. The lawyer began presenting the case with clarity and precision, outlining the incident, the impact on the man, and the evidence collected. Every word was deliberate, measured, and factual. The officer's confidence seemed to waver slightly as the lawyer spoke, a subtle but noticeable shift in demeanor. When it was the man's turn to speak, he stood slowly, letting his presence fill the space. His voice was steady, calm, and clear. He recounted the incident as he had practiced, carefully describing the moment the officer shoved him, the fall, and the pain that followed. He spoke of the fear, the humiliation, and the emotional impact that lingered long after the event. He did not yell, he did not exaggerate, he simply spoke the truth. The courtroom was quiet, attentive. The judge listened closely, nodding occasionally. The witnesses, called one by one, added details that corroborated his account. They described seeing the shove, the sudden fall, and the officer's aggressive behavior. Some witnesses even recounted how they had feared intervening, how they had filmed the incident to ensure there was evidence. Each statement strengthened the man's case, adding weight to his words. At one point, the officer was asked to respond. He spoke carefully, trying to maintain authority, but the words seemed rehearsed, defensive, and unconvincing. The evidence, the video, the witness statements, and the medical records stood firmly against him. The man watched quietly, focusing on remaining calm, letting the truth speak louder than fear or intimidation. The tension in the room was palpable. Every glance, every movement, and every word carried weight. The officer shifted in his seat, occasionally glancing toward the man. There was a sense of discomfort, a realization that the balance of power had changed. The man, who had once been knocked to the ground, now held the attention of the courtroom. His voice, his story, and the evidence had created a space where authority could no longer dominate unchecked. Throughout the proceedings, the lawyer skillfully presented additional evidence. Medical reports documented the injuries sustained during the fall, showing that the shove had caused more than superficial pain. Witness statements emphasized the unprovoked nature of the incident. The video footage, played in front of the court, captured the exact moment the officer pushed the man down. Each piece reinforced the reality of what had happened, making it difficult for the officer's defense to stand. The man felt a mixture of emotions as the hearing continued. There was tension, yes, and nerves that never fully disappeared. But there was also a growing sense of empowerment. He was no longer a passive participant. He was an active part of the process, a person demanding accountability and fairness. Every moment in the courtroom reinforced that standing up for oneself, even against authority, was both possible and necessary. At one point, the officer attempted to interrupt, to challenge a witness's statement. The judge quickly restored order. reminding him of the rules and emphasizing that the process required respect and honesty. The officer's composure faltered slightly. The man noticed a flicker of frustration, perhaps even fear, in the officer's eyes. For the first time since the incident, the officer seemed uncertain, aware that the power dynamic had shifted. The man's lawyer called upon additional witnesses, people who had interacted with him immediately after the incident. They described his demeanor, the visible pain, and his calm approach despite the aggression he had faced. These accounts reinforced the man's credibility, showing that he had acted responsibly and respectfully even under duress. The courtroom atmosphere shifted subtly. Support for the man's account grew, and the officer's attempts at defense appeared increasingly strained. Throughout the hearing, the man maintained his focus. He avoided looking at the officer directly unless necessary, keeping his attention on the facts and the evidence. He remembered the lessons from his preparation: clarity, calm, and truth. His voice did not waver, his posture remained composed, and his responses were deliberate. Each word, each gesture reflected the strength he had cultivated over the weeks of preparation. The community support he had received played a quiet but powerful role. Some witnesses had come from his neighborhood, others from nearby streets, all expressing concern and solidarity. Their presence was visible, a subtle reminder that the incident had not occurred in isolation. The man's actions were part of a larger story about fairness, accountability, and standing up against injustice. As the hearing progressed, the lawyer began summarizing the evidence and key points. The video footage was highlighted again, witness credibility emphasized, and the emotional and physical impact on the man described in detail. The lawyer's closing statements were measured but passionate, drawing attention to the unprovoked nature of the incident and the need for accountability. The courtroom seemed to lean into every word, the tension palpable but shifting in favor of truth. The officer's defense attorney attempted to argue that the man had provoked the situation or that the shove was necessary for control. However, the evidence was too clear. The video captured the moment precisely. Witnesses consistently testified to the officer's unprovoked aggression, and medical documentation confirmed the injuries. The defense's arguments faltered, their impact weakened by the undeniable facts. The man watched silently, maintaining his composure. He felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, not from a desire for revenge, but from knowing that the truth had been presented. He had faced fear, humiliation, and aggression, yet here he was, standing firm with evidence and witnesses supporting his account. The officer's attempts to undermine him seemed futile, and the courtroom's focus remained on the events themselves, not the authority that had tried to dominate. As the hearing neared its conclusion, the judge addressed the court, acknowledging the evidence presented and the credibility of the witnesses. The atmosphere was serious, respectful, and attentive. The man felt a sense of relief, though he knew the final decision would come later. For now, the truth had been laid bare. He had faced the officer directly, recounted the incident clearly, and shown that resilience and preparation could overcome fear and intimidation. The officer, for his part, appeared uncomfortable. His earlier confidence had diminished, replaced by a tense awareness of accountability. He had expected perhaps to intimidate or dismiss, but the courtroom had operated under a different set of rules that valued truth, fairness, and evidence over authority alone. The officer's frozen expression suggested he had not anticipated the man's preparedness, the witness's clarity, or the power of documented evidence. The man left the courtroom that day with a mixture of exhaustion and quiet pride. He had faced a challenging emotional situation and emerged with dignity and tact. He had stood for himself, presented evidence, and allowed the truth to guide the proceedings. The weeks of preparation, community support, and careful practice had paid off. He felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the legal process. He had reclaimed some measure of control over a moment that had once left him feeling powerless. Outside, the sunlight was warm, and the sounds of the city felt different. There was a sense of hope, a sense that justice, though sometimes slow, could be pursued and achieved. The man walked steadily, aware of the journey ahead but confident in the steps he had already taken. The courtroom encounter had been challenging, yes, but it had also been empowering. He had faced fear, humiliation, and authority, and he had stood firm. He knew that the officer would soon face consequences, that accountability was on the horizon, and that the process would continue. But more importantly, he had discovered something essential within himself: the courage to confront injustice, the resilience to endure difficulty, and the ability to maintain dignity even in the face of fear. These lessons would stay with him, shaping the way he approached life, challenges, and the pursuit of fairness in the future. The days after the courtroom hearing were filled with a tense anticipation. The man and his lawyer had presented their case clearly and calmly. Witnesses had supported his account, and the video evidence had been undeniable. Yet the outcome was still in the hands of the court. Every morning, he woke with a mix of hope and anxiety, wondering what the final judgment would be. The waiting was difficult, but he knew he had done everything possible to ensure the truth was known. During these days, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The memory of being shoved to the ground by the officer still lingered, but it no longer carried the same weight of fear. Instead, it reminded him of his resilience, of the courage it had taken to stand up and document the incident, to gather witnesses, and to prepare for the courtroom. He realized that while the incident had been humiliating, it had also shown him the strength he carried within himself. Friends and family continued to provide support. They checked in frequently, offering encouragement and listening patiently as he shared his thoughts and worries. Their presence reminded him that he was not facing this challenge alone. The journey toward justice was not just an individual effort. It was shared with those who cared, who believed in fairness, and who understood the impact of such events on ordinary lives. He also found solace in small daily routines: morning walks through the neighborhood, quiet moments in the park, and even the act of making a cup of tea became opportunities to center himself. These small, ordinary actions helped him maintain balance, keeping his focus on what he could control while accepting the things he could not. They reminded him that life continued, even amid the tension and uncertainty of waiting for a court decision. The community that had supported him throughout this ordeal remained an important presence. People who had witnessed the incident or heard about it expressed continued encouragement. Some shared stories of similar experiences, creating a sense of solidarity and shared purpose. The man found that this support was not only comforting but also empowering. It reminded him that accountability was not just a personal goal. It was part of a broader effort to ensure fairness in the community. When the day of the verdict finally arrived, the man felt a mixture of nerves and determination. He dressed carefully, choosing clothes that conveyed respect and seriousness. He met his lawyer outside the courtroom, and together they reviewed key points one last time. The lawyer reminded him to remain calm, to trust in the evidence presented, and to allow the truth to speak for itself. The man took deep breaths, steadying his heart and focusing on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Entering the courtroom, he felt the familiar sense of gravity that had accompanied him before. The judge took their seat. The room fell silent and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The officer was present as well, sitting rigidly, clearly aware that the consequences of his actions were about to be addressed. There was a tension in the air, a quiet energy that spoke of accountability and the weight of truth. The judge began by summarizing the case, reviewing the key points and acknowledging the evidence presented. The video footage, witness statements, and medical reports were referenced, highlighting the unprovoked nature of the incident and the impact it had on the man. As the judge spoke, the man listened carefully, feeling a sense of calm confidence. The truth was being recognized, and the effort he had put into preparing his case was reflected in every word. The officer's demeanor shifted as the summary continued. His earlier confidence had faded, replaced by a visible tension. He glanced at the man, briefly meeting his gaze, and for a moment his expression betrayed a mixture of surprise, regret, and unease. It was clear that the courtroom had changed the dynamic of authority. The officer was no longer in control. The evidence, witnesses, and truth had taken center stage. When the verdict was announced, the man felt a wave of relief and quiet satisfaction. The court had ruled in his favor, holding the officer accountable for his actions. There would be consequences, measures to ensure that such behavior was addressed and prevented in the future. The legal process had worked as it was meant to, giving weight to evidence, testimony, and fairness rather than intimidation or unchecked authority. As the decision was read aloud, the man allowed himself a small, controlled smile. Relief flooded him. not from triumph over another person, but from the knowledge that justice had been served. He felt validated, not only as a person who had been wronged, but as someone who had taken action to ensure that truth and fairness prevailed. The months of preparation, reflection, and perseverance had culminated in a moment that reinforced the importance of standing up for oneself. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving the man and his lawyer to gather their belongings. Outside, sunlight spilled over the steps and the city seemed to move with its usual rhythm. Yet for the man, the world felt different. He walked with a sense of dignity and empowerment. The fear that had once gripped him had been replaced with confidence, resilience, and a deep understanding of his own strength. He reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the moment he had been knocked to the ground, through the weeks of gathering evidence, speaking to witnesses, and preparing for the courtroom, he had learned lessons about courage, persistence, and the value of support from others. Each step, no matter how difficult, had built toward this moment of acknowledgement and accountability. The officer, meanwhile, left the courtroom in silence. The man noticed the hesitation in his movements, the absence of the earlier confidence. There was an unmistakable recognition that the actions of the past had consequences, and that accountability could not be avoided. The man did not feel triumph over the officer, only a quiet satisfaction that fairness had prevailed. In the days that followed, the man continued to reflect on the experience. He thought about how quickly ordinary life could change, how a single act of aggression could have long-lasting effects, and how taking action could reclaim a sense of control. He realized that the courage he had shown was not just about facing an officer. It was about standing up to fear, asserting dignity, and demanding justice in a world where power often overshadowed fairness. He also considered the impact on his community. People who had witnessed the incident, supported him, or simply followed the case were reminded of the importance of accountability. The story became an example of resilience and courage, showing that ordinary people could take meaningful steps to ensure fairness and justice. The man felt a sense of connection to these individuals, recognizing that collective awareness and action were vital in confronting injustice. The experience left a lasting impression on him. He had confronted fear, humiliation, and authority, yet had emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident. He had learned the importance of preparation, the value of support, and the power of truth. These lessons would guide him in the future, not only in legal matters but in everyday life, reinforcing the belief that fairness and integrity mattered. Even when facing challenging circumstances, over time, the physical reminders of the incident, the soreness, the discomfort, faded. The emotional and psychological impact, however, remained a source of reflection. He continued to think about the balance of power, the responsibility of authority figures, and the importance of standing up when wronged. He knew that the world was not always fair, but he also knew that courage, preparation, and persistence could create meaningful change. He remained grateful for the lawyer who had guided him, for the witnesses who had spoken truthfully, and for the friends and family who had offered unwavering support. Each had played a role in the journey, and their contributions reinforced the idea that justice was rarely a solitary pursuit. It was a collaborative effort, requiring trust, determination, and belief in the power of truth. The man also reflected on his own growth. The incident had forced him to confront fear, vulnerability, and injustice in ways he had never anticipated. It had challenged him to act decisively, to organize evidence, to speak clearly, and to maintain composure under pressure. These experiences had strengthened his character, leaving him better equipped to handle challenges in the future. As he moved forward, he carried with him a quiet sense of responsibility. He understood that standing up for oneself was not only a personal act, it was a statement about fairness, dignity, and accountability. He also recognized that sharing his experience could empower others, encouraging them to confront injustice and assert their rights with courage and clarity. Life slowly returned to a more ordinary rhythm. He resumed daily routines, engaged